Martha, a 72-year-old woman, barely noticed how her life had transformed into an exhausting routine. Inside a house that once was a home, she now moved like a shadow, performing tasks that had long ceased to be voluntary. Her daughter, Rebecca, who had returned to her mother's house a few years ago with the promise of helping her age in peace, now treated her like a servant. The days dragged on in silence, while Rebecca, acclaimed in court as a brilliant lawyer, skillfully hid the cruelty that reigned within her own home. But an unexpected phone call would trigger a sequence of events that no one could foresee. And when David, the distant brother, unexpectedly appeared at the door, the house of cards that Rebecca had built began to crumble. A devastating truth was about to be revealed, and nothing would be the same again. When the truth destroys, the incredible battle of a son to save his mother from his own sister. Martha arranged the living room for the third time that morning, even knowing that Rebecca never noticed her efforts. There was no longer the sparkle in the eyes of a devoted mother, only the shadow of a weary woman whose only motivation was to avoid her daughter's disappointment. The wrinkled hands polished the dark wood of the coffee table with almost compulsive care, an attempt to maintain peace in an environment where love had long since faded. Rebecca crossed the room with firm steps, the cell phone glued to her ear. Dressed impeccably in a gray suit, it seemed that the weight of the world rested on her shoulders, but only in appearance. Without taking her eyes off the screen, she tossed her bag onto the sofa, completely ignoring her mother's presence. Her voice was dry, direct, slicing through the air with an authority that Martha had learned to fear. "Mom, is lunch not ready yet?" The question came as a command, not as simple curiosity. Martha murmured an affirmative response and hurried to the kitchen. The anguish inside her was a constant, but she no longer had the strength to protest. As she chopped the vegetables for the salad, a deep sadness overwhelmed her. Why had her daughter, her own flesh and blood, transformed into someone so distant, so cold? She wondered if there was something she could have done differently, if some past mistake had condemned her to this existence. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Martha dried her hands on her apron and went to answer, finding the imposing figure of David at the door. Her son's gray hair was slightly tousled, and he bore an expression that mixed surprise and concern. "David!" The surprise in her voice was evident, but there was also a certain relief, a spark of hope she didn't dare express. David stepped inside, embracing his mother with an intensity that seemed to want to make up for the years of absence. His eyes quickly scanned the room, picking up details that spoke for themselves. The fatigue on Martha's face, the austerity of the house, the absence of any sign of familial warmth. "Is everything okay, Mom?" The question came laden with concern. Martha hesitated, as she always did. She didn't want to worry her son, didn't want to admit what was happening there. But David was perceptive. He always had been. He could read between the lines. "Yes, David, everything is under control." The lie slipped out without conviction, but it was all she could manage to say. Rebecca appeared at the top of the stairs, surprised to see her brother at home. She tried to force a smile, but there was something in her gaze that betrayed a growing tension. "David, I didn't know you were coming." Her voice sounded controlled, but there was a rigidity that didn't go unnoticed. David didn't respond immediately. He looked at Rebecca, then at Martha, and something stirred within him. This wasn't just a casual visit, and he felt that something was terribly wrong. "I thought it was time for a surprise visit," he finally replied, trying to keep his tone light, but his eyes didn't lie. They sought answers he didn't want to hear, but knew he needed. The tension in the room was palpable, but no one spoke a word. Martha withdrew, returning to the kitchen, while Rebecca descended the stairs, approaching her brother. "Let's talk, David," Rebecca suggested, trying to keep calm in her voice, but whatever was hidden began to emerge, threatening to explode at any moment. David nodded, but the truth was about to break the silence, and nothing could stop it. David and Rebecca sat in the living room, where the conversation unfolded slowly, like a game of chess where each move was carefully calculated. Rebecca spoke about work, about how busy she was, how she cared for their mother with all the love she could muster. But David listened, only listened, with a grave expression. He knew that something was out of place, something that was being hidden behind that well-constructed facade. While Rebecca continued to speak, Martha peeked from the kitchen, her heart aching. Every word that came out of her daughter's mouth felt like a blade, cutting her inside because she knew it wasn't true. Rebecca never mentioned how she treated her, how she made her feel small, unworthy. Martha wished David wouldn't notice, that he wouldn't ask questions she would have to answer with painful truths. But David wasn't foolish. He interrupted Rebecca with a direct question. "Mom, how are you really?" His eyes fixed on Martha were piercing, as if they were trying to pull the truth out of her just with a look. Martha felt a knot in her throat. She knew she couldn't keep hiding what was happening, but the fear of facing Rebecca paralyzed her. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words got stuck. Rebecca quickly took the lead, smiling amiably. "David, you know how she is. Always worrying, even when she doesn't need to. It's all fine, really." David watched his sister, noticing how she tried to control the narrative. He knew something was wrong, but he still wasn't sure what it was. He leaned back on the sofa, crossing his arms, keeping his gaze fixed on Rebecca. "Really?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with suspicion. Martha knew this was the moment. If she didn't speak now, she might never have the courage again. Her heart raced, but she knew she had to do something. Finally, with a trembling voice, she whispered, "David, there's something you need to know." Rebecca immediately stood up, interrupting her mother. "Mom, please, let's not do this now." But David wouldn't be deceived. He also stood up, moving closer to Martha, holding her hands firmly. "What is it, Mom?" he asked, ignoring Rebecca, focusing all his attention on Martha. Martha's eyes filled with tears. She knew that once she started speaking, there would be no turning back. The weight of years of silence was about to be released, and she could no longer hold it in. "Rebecca, Martha began, but her voice faltered. Rebecca moved forward, trying to prevent her mother from continuing, but David intervened, placing himself between the two. "Let her speak, Rebecca," he ordered, his voice now filled with authority, no longer willing to accept excuses or lies. The silence that followed was deafening, and finally, Martha found the strength to say what she had kept hidden for so long. "Rebecca doesn't treat me like a mother, David. She treats me like a maid. I'm tired, exhausted. I can't take it anymore." Rebecca stood still, her face losing color. David, on the other hand, felt a rage building inside him, a rage he didn't know he was capable of feeling. He turned to his sister, his eyes blazing. "What have you done?" The question came with contained fury, as he tried to process what he had just heard. Rebecca tried to defend herself, but the words seemed to escape her lips. She knew the truth had been revealed, and now she would have to face the consequences of her actions. David, still holding Martha's hands, felt a determination grow within him. He wouldn't let his mother suffer anymore, and he knew he needed to act before it was too late. David looked at Rebecca with a mix of disbelief and disappointment. The revelation from Martha still echoed in his mind. What he had just discovered seemed impossible to believe. His own sister, the one he had trusted to take care of their mother, was abusing Martha in a cruel and unimaginable way. The rage within him grew like a storm about to explode. Rebecca stepped back, feeling the weight of David's gaze. She tried to find the right words, but everything felt empty and devoid of justification. She knew she had crossed a line that would be difficult, if not impossible, to return from. I just wanted her to be okay," Rebecca murmured, but her voice sounded fragile, far from her usual self-confidence. David, still holding a firm look on his sister, shook his head slowly. "Is this what you call caring, Rebecca?" The words came heavy, laden with disappointment that cut deeper than any accusation. Rebecca tried to explain herself, but David wasn't willing to listen. He let go of Martha's hands, which were now trembling slightly, weakness taking over her body. "Mom, go to your room and rest. I need to talk to Rebecca," he said, his voice softer as he addressed his mother. Martha nodded, relieved yet worried about what might happen next. She left slowly, and David waited until he heard her bedroom door close before turning his full attention back to Rebecca. "How could you do this?" David's question came heavy with pain and disbelief. "You convinced Mom to sign documents that transfer everything she has to you. And now? What was the plan, Rebecca? To put her in a nursing home and live with a clear conscience?" Rebecca, visibly shaken, took a step back. The truth she had tried to hide for so long was now exposed in a brutal way. "David, I was just trying to secure her future, and ours." Rebecca's voice trembled as she tried to justify her actions, but the words sounded empty. "Secure her future? Or secure yours?" David stepped forward, his eyes burning with indignation. "You were going to send her away to keep everything, Rebecca? And if it weren't for that friend who called me, I wouldn't even know what you were doing." Rebecca felt a wave of despair rising within her. She knew her actions were beyond any reasonable excuse, but the fear of losing everything she had built, including the perfect image she had so carefully protected, was overwhelming. "I was scared, David. Scared of being alone, with nothing, after everything I've been through. I couldn't just leave things as they were." She tried, but her words were met with a cold stare. "Scared? Scared of what, Rebecca? Of being a decent daughter? Of taking care of our mother as she deserves?" David moved closer, his voice now filled with a cutting chill. "You chose the easier path, the path of greed, and now I have to fix this." Rebecca fell silent, unable to respond. She knew David was right, but admitting it was the same as admitting that everything she had fought for, all the sacrifices she made in the name of her career and image, meant nothing if the truth came to light. David looked at his sister with a mix of sadness and fury, then turned away, grabbing his phone. He knew he needed to act quickly before Rebecca had a chance to manipulate the situation further. He called a lawyer friend, someone he trusted deeply, and scheduled an urgent meeting to discuss legal options. "I won't let you get away with this, Rebecca." David's final words were harsh but necessary. "If you thought I would turn my back on our mother, you were completely mistaken." Rebecca felt tears silently streaming down her face, but there was no more room for regret or pity. David was determined to seek justice, and she knew that what would come next could destroy everything she had built. David left to meet with the lawyer, leaving Rebecca alone with her thoughts. She sat on the couch, trying to process everything that had happened. She knew David wouldn't back down and that her life was about to be turned upside down. The fear of losing her reputation, her job, and everything she had fought for became nearly unbearable. Hours later, David returned, his expression serious and resolute. He didn't say a word to Rebecca, but the look he shot her was enough to make her feel even more apprehensive. Martha was in her room, resting, and David knew he needed to protect her at all costs. As he walked towards their mother's room, David felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He entered quietly and approached the bed where Martha lay resting. Her face was calm, but David knew the peace she appeared to have was far from reality. He sat down next to her, holding her hand tenderly. "We're going to fix this, Mom. I promise." David's voice was firm, but there was a touch of sadness. He knew he was about to face a battle that could destroy his relationship with Rebecca forever, but he had no choice. Rebecca stood at the door, watching the scene with a mix of pain and regret. She knew the situation had reached a critical point, and there was no turning back. The final confrontation was approaching, and the consequences would be devastating. David got up, casting one last look at his sister before leaving the room. Rebecca remained there for a moment, feeling the weight of guilt and fear crushing her defenses. She knew she had lost her brother's trust, and possibly any chance of redemption. However, as David took the reins to protect their mother, something unexpected began to stir within Rebecca. The fear of public exposure and legal consequences was real, but a deeper feeling, a vulnerability she had never allowed to surface, started to emerge. The old letters she still kept, hidden in a drawer at the back of her closet, now seemed to call out to her, like a reminder of a past she had avoided for so long. Rebecca approached her room, her heart heavy, and began to rummage through the drawers until she found what she was looking for. The letters from her father, carefully kept, brought back memories of a time when everything seemed simpler, safer. As she read through those words, there was something more. The resentment she had nurtured for so long, the feeling that she had never been enough, that she would always remain in her brother's shadow. Rebecca read the letters, one by one, as silent tears streamed down her face. The hurt she had carried for so many years was laid bare in words she had never had the courage to say out loud. But now, confronted with the harsh reality of her actions, she found herself compelled to face these feelings. David, on the other hand, was focused on preparing his mother's defense. The revelations he had uncovered in conversations with the lawyer only fueled his determination. The documents Rebecca had made Martha sign were a clear attempt to usurp their mother's assets, and David knew he needed to act quickly to reverse the situation before it was too late. He returned home with the resolve to confront Rebecca one last time before taking any legal action. But upon entering his sister's room, he found her crying silently, with the old letters spread across the bed. She lifted her red eyes to him, and David saw something he hadn't expected: genuine remorse. "David," Rebecca began, but her voice faltered. David remained silent, waiting as Rebecca struggled to find the words she needed to say. "I never managed to deal with this, with the feeling that you were always the favorite, the one who always succeeded. I thought I had to be perfect, that I had to show that I could do everything on my own. But I was wrong," Rebecca finally admitted, the words coming out with effort. David felt a tightening in his chest upon hearing his sister's confession. He had always known there was tension between them, but he had never imagined her resentment ran so deep. However, that did not justify what she had done. "Rebecca, what you did to Mom can't be justified by this," David replied firmly, though he felt a weight in saying it. Rebecca nodded, knowing that David was right. "I know, and I am willing to fix things, to return everything. I can't undo what I've done, but I can try to repair the damage. I just ask that you give me a chance to do this without destroying what's left of our family." Rebecca's voice was almost a whisper, filled with desperation. David watched his sister for a long moment, seeing for the first time her true vulnerability. He wanted to believe she was sincere, but he knew he couldn't risk their mother's well-being on just a promise. "If you really want to fix things, Rebecca, then you're going to have to prove it," David finally replied, with a firmness that made it clear he would not easily yield. Rebecca nodded again, knowing she would have to do more than just speak to regain her brother's trust, and more importantly, to ensure their mother's safety. She knew the journey ahead would be difficult, but she had no other choice. David stood up, feeling the weight of the decision. He would give Rebecca one chance, but only one, and if she failed, he would not hesitate to take the necessary steps to protect their mother. With that thought in mind, he left Rebecca's room, knowing that the coming weeks would be crucial in defining the family's future. The path to reconciliation and justice was just beginning, and all of them, especially Rebecca, would have to confront the ghosts of the past and the consequences of the present. David spent the following days alongside Martha, closely monitoring Rebecca's actions. Despite his sister's promises, he knew he couldn't blindly trust her. Meanwhile, the legal process continued to unfold. David kept in frequent contact with the lawyer, reviewing every detail of the documents Rebecca had manipulated to transfer Martha's assets into her name. The coldness with which Rebecca had orchestrated everything was still a shock to David, but he knew he had to stay focused on protecting their mother. Rebecca, on the other hand, was in a state of deep introspection. Reading the letters and confronting David had left her emotionally vulnerable. She knew she had crossed a line by manipulating their mother in that way, and that the consequences could be devastating. While she was determined to make amends, the shadow of what she had done haunted her every moment. One afternoon, David received a call from the lawyer. He had news that could change the course of the situation. "David, we've found an opening." The lawyer's voice sounded firm, but there was a note of caution. "It seems Rebecca made a mistake in the documents. She didn't follow all the necessary legal procedures to ensure the validity of the signatures. This gives us a chance to reverse the transfer of the assets." David felt an immediate sense of relief upon hearing this, but he also knew that this battle was far from over. "What do we need to do now?" he asked, eager to take action. "We need to file a motion immediately to contest the documents and ensure that your mother doesn't lose her assets. However, this also means that Rebecca will be formally notified and will have to respond legally. You need to be prepared for the impact this will have on your relationship with her," the lawyer explained, making it clear that the consequences would be profound. David pondered for a moment, but he knew he had no other choice. "Do what needs to be done. My priority is to protect my mother," David replied with determination. As the legal process advanced, Rebecca began to realize the gravity of what was to come. She received the official court notification and learned that David had decided not to wait for any more promises. She would be forced to face the consequences of her actions in front of a judge. Panic started to take hold of her. Losing Martha's assets was one thing, but being publicly exposed, having her career and reputation destroyed, was something she couldn't bear. Desperate, Rebecca tried one last time to talk to David. She found him in the living room, where he was reviewing the legal documents with a serious expression. "David, we need to talk." Her voice was trembling, but there was an urgency that David couldn't ignore. He looked at his sister, seeing the desperation in her eyes. For a moment he hesitated, but then nodded, indicating for her to sit down. "Speak, Rebecca," David said, trying to maintain his composure. Rebecca took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. "I know you have no reason to trust me, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to avoid this going to court. I'm not trying to escape the consequences, but I'm begging you to consider a different solution." The words came out with difficulty, but Rebecca knew this was her last chance. David remained silent, analyzing each of her words. He knew that Rebecca was sincerely regretful, but the pain and distrust were still very present. Even so, a part of him didn't want to see his sister destroyed. He didn't want to carry the weight of being responsible for that. "And what do you suggest?" David finally asked, his voice neutral. Rebecca breathed a sigh of relief that he was willing to listen. "I'll return everything, every cent, every property, and I commit to seeking professional help. I know I need to change, that I need to deal with the issues that led me to act this way. Just don't expose me publicly, David. I don't know if I could handle that," she pleaded, her eyes glistening with tears. David pondered for a long moment. He knew that what Rebecca was asking was difficult, but he also knew that despite everything, she was still his sister, and deep down, He didn't want to be the cause of her total ruin. He also thought about Martha and how this could impact her emotionally. "If I agree to this, Rebecca, it will only be because I want our mother to have peace. I'm not doing this for you, but for her," David finally said, his voice firm. Rebecca nodded quickly, understanding the condition. "Thank you, David. I will really do things differently." Her words were sincere, but there was still a palpable fear in her tone. David made a call to the lawyer, informing him of the new decision. The lawyer expressed his concerns, but David was determined. He knew he would need to be vigilant, but he believed that with proper supervision, he could ensure that Rebecca kept her promise. The following days were tense, but marked by a series of concrete steps. With David's help and the lawyer's guidance, Rebecca began the process of returning Martha's assets. The house, the savings, everything was carefully transferred back into their mother's name. David monitored each step, ensuring that nothing was left to chance. Martha, who followed everything from a distance, began to feel a growing sense of relief. Although the process was painful, she knew she was finally regaining control over her life. The relationship between David and Rebecca was still fragile, but there was a silent truce between them, a hope that perhaps with time, the wounds could begin to heal. However, something within David still troubled him. While organizing Martha's old documents, he found an old diary, something he hadn't seen since his youth. The diary was worn, the pages yellowed with age, but when he opened it, he found something he didn't expect. His mother's words, carefully recorded over the years. Martha's diary was a mix of happy memories and bitter reflections on what had happened to her family. As David flipped through the pages, he discovered a side of Martha he had never known, a side that revealed the depth of her pains and frustrations. But what caught his attention the most were the entries that mentioned Rebecca. They were old, dating back years, and described a young Rebecca who constantly felt inferior, always in the shadow of her older brother, desperately trying to please a father who seemed to favor him. David read those words with a tightening in his chest. He had never realized how much Rebecca suffered in silence, how deeply she had internalized a sense of inadequacy that had gnawed at her over the years. The letters Rebecca had kept from their father, which David had only seen in passing, now made more sense. They were the expression of a soul that felt neglected, seeking recognition, and over time had turned that insecurity into selfish and destructive actions. David closed the diary with a mix of sadness and empathy. He was still deeply hurt by Rebecca's actions, but for the first time he could see beyond the surface. He saw a sister who had lost herself amid her own demons, a sister who, despite everything, was still part of the family he wanted to protect. David knew that the path to reconciliation would be long and hard, but armed with the understanding he now possessed, he was willing to try. Deep down, he wanted to believe that with time, Rebecca could find her way back, not only to the family but to herself. He decided to keep the diary. He wouldn't mention to Rebecca that he had read those words, knowing that this was Martha's secret, something she hadn't shared in life. But he would hold on to that knowledge as a moral compass, something to guide him in the upcoming decisions, in the search for a balance between justice and compassion. The process of returning the belongings was concluded without major issues, and David stood by his mother at every step. When it was all over, Martha insisted on continuing to live with David in Los Angeles. He agreed, knowing it would be best for her, and he also agreed to maintain regular contact with Rebecca, but with some clear conditions. Rebecca, for her part, began therapy, recognizing that she needed help to deal with her feelings and to rebuild her life in a healthier way. She knew the journey would be long, but she was determined to move forward, with the hope of one day regaining her brother's trust and the peace of mind she so desperately sought. The relationship between the three was still far from what it once was, but for the first time in years, there was a chance they could rebuild something new, based on a painful but necessary truth. With the legal process completed and Martha's belongings duly returned, David felt a sense of relief, but also a weight that had not yet been completely lifted. The decision to give Rebecca a chance to redeem herself had been made in honor of their mother, but he still struggled to fully forgive her. The revelations from Martha's diary remained fresh in his mind, and although he understood the motivations behind his sister's actions, he could not ignore the damage she had caused. The day of the court hearing arrived, and despite all the arrangements, Rebecca needed to be present for the court to formalize the reversal of the belongings. David and Martha would also be there, and for the first time since the beginning of the conflict, they would all meet together in an environment they could not control. In court, the atmosphere was tense. Martha was visibly nervous, and David, despite trying to stay calm, could not hide his worry. Rebecca, on the other hand, was pale but determined to face whatever came. She knew that this moment was crucial, not only for the future of her relationship with her mother and brother, but for her own redemption. The judge began the session, and the lawyers presented the case. Rebecca, as expected, returned all the belongings to Martha, and the judge, after hearing all parties, made his final decision, closing the case. The formality of the environment contrasted with the depth of the feelings at stake. When the judge finally declared the case closed, a sense of relief washed over everyone, but it was not a complete relief, just a partial release of the accumulated tensions. After the hearing, David approached Rebecca. They hadn't had a deep conversation since the beginning of the process of returning the belongings. He knew that this was the moment to put everything to the test, to see if the Rebecca standing before him was truly someone willing to change. "Rebecca, I know the hearing has ended, but what we need to resolve between us is not," David began, his voice firm but not hostile. Rebecca nodded, her eyes fixed on her brother. "I know, David. I don't expect you to trust me immediately, but I'm here to prove that I'm changing. I will continue with therapy, and I want to find a way to regain your trust, even if it takes time." There was sincerity in her words, something David couldn't ignore. "It will take time, yes, but for now, I'm willing to take small steps," David replied, crossing his arms but without the tone of condemnation that had previously dominated their interactions. Martha, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, finally intervened. She was tired, both physically and emotionally, but there was something she needed to say. "Rebecca, all I want is for our family to reconcile. I forgive you, my daughter, but understand that forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. We need to rebuild trust, and that will require a lot from all of us." Martha's words were gentle but laden with wisdom and pain. Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face, but this time it was not just guilt or fear. It was the feeling of a possibility, however remote, of redemption. "Thank you, Mom. I will do my best to deserve this forgiveness." Her voice was a whisper, but it carried the determination of someone who knew she was starting from scratch. With the hearing over and promises made, the family left the courthouse. David and Martha returned to Los Angeles, while Rebecca, now without Martha's assets, began to reorganize her life in New York. Therapy, as she had promised, became a central part of her routine, and slowly she started to recognize the deep roots of her insecurities and resentments. With each session, she found herself closer to confronting the demons that had led her to betray her own mother's trust. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, David tried to balance his work as a doctor with caring for his mother. Martha, although more at peace with the restored security, still carried the emotional weight of everything that had happened. She dedicated herself to small activities at home, trying to keep her mind occupied. But David knew she was far from fully recovering. One day, while organizing some old documents in the office, David found a letter that his mother had kept for a long time. It wasn't part of the diary, but a letter written by Rebecca, still a teenager, addressed to their father. It was a letter that had never been sent. David read the words penned in a young, anxious handwriting. Rebecca expressed her desire to be recognized, to be seen by her father as a worthy daughter, as someone who could have the same respect and affection that David always seemed to receive. That letter, more than anything else, made David realize how deeply rooted Rebecca's feelings of inadequacy were. He found himself reflecting on their childhood, trying to remember moments when he might have inadvertently contributed to his sister's emotional isolation. He knew he had to do something, not only for his mother but also for Rebecca. He reached out to her one weekend, calling her in New York. "Rebecca, I need you to come to Los Angeles. I want us to talk about all this in person, and I think we can start rebuilding something together." David's voice was direct, but there was a tone of invitation, not of imposition. Rebecca was surprised, but also felt a sense of relief. Perhaps this was the opportunity she had long hoped for, a chance to begin rebuilding her relationship with her brother and mother. She accepted the invitation, and, the following weekend, she was in Los Angeles. The conversation that followed was long and filled with emotions. David spoke about the letter he found, about how he was beginning to better understand her feelings, while Rebecca, in turn, confessed how the constant comparisons with David throughout their childhood and adolescence had created a resentment that transformed into destructive actions in adulthood. Martha participated in the conversation, but this time without the weight of accusations or grievances, but with a vision of hope. She saw her children finally trying to understand each other, something she had wished for so many years. By the end of the conversation, there were no grand promises, but a common understanding that, to move forward, they needed to be honest, patient, and willing to face together the emotional challenges that still existed. Rebecca returned to New York, but this time with the certainty that, despite everything, she was no longer alone. David promised that they would keep in constant contact and that soon he and Martha would visit her. She knew that their relationship was still under reconstruction, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a genuine hope that, eventually, everything could heal. Martha, in turn, traveled with David to New York a few months later. They spent a few days together, and Martha, seeing Rebecca in her new stage of life, realized that her daughter was finally beginning to find a different path, away from the shadows of the past. David and Rebecca still had a long way to go, but they were willing to travel it. The love that remained between them, even though wounded, began to show signs of recovery. And so, little by little, the family that had been almost destroyed by resentments and misunderstandings began to rebuild itself, not as it had been before, but in a new way, perhaps stronger, certainly more aware of the challenges that family ties can face, but also of the joys they can still bring. We hope you enjoyed this narrative. Please help by leaving your like and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss more touching stories that resonate with the soul. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. We would love to know what you think, and feedback and critiques are also welcome. We'll see you in the next emotional video. Until then,